Well, joining us for more on some of the big security and defense issues around this very consequential G7 summit happening right here in Alberta. Very pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Rob Huebert, professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Calgary, and interim director of the Center for Military and Security and Strategic Studies. Dr. Huebert, great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Oh, my pleasure, Rob.
Well, now suddenly we've got the shadow of this Israeli attack on Iran and a conflict there kind of looming large over this summit. How big an issue is that, first of all?
It's a huge issue. I mean, it touches on so many different elements that are developing that the G7 has to face. I mean, first and foremost, we're seeing this much more dangerous geopolitical environment where we're seeing the utilization of force in a whole host of conflicts that the G7 is going to have to somehow come to terms with. We've had the successful Ukrainian strike on the Russian Air Force capability. Now we have, of course, the Israelis attacking Iran, and we know that the Iranians will probably try to come up with some form of reaction. But it also ties into the bigger picture, of course, the American, and to a lesser degree, the European efforts to deal with the nuclear program of Iran. And so all of this makes it very dangerous and very, very complicated.
Well, indeed. I mean, even before this, I think we knew that the stakes were high for this summit. We think back to previous G7 gatherings. I mean, how much does this one stand out? How big is this summit?
Well, the biggest element of this particular G7 is that all other preceding G7s tended to have a somewhat unified view within its membership, with the exception, of course, when the Russians were included for the G8 and then subsequent to their invasion of Ukraine back in 2014. But the challenge here today is the fact that one of the most important economic challenges that the G7 is facing is being caused by one of its own members. The tariffs and the trade wars that the Trump administration has unleashed on its fellow members within the G7 is probably one of the most crucial economic issue that they are facing. And remember, the G7 was created to deal with economic issues that were really coming from the outside. I mean, you have to go back to the 1970s when it was created as the G5, and it was really to respond to the oil crisis that was occurring back following the both the 1973 war and the subsequent Iranian Revolution, where all sorts of economic difficulties. But it was a unified Western approach, including Japan, of course, as a Western state, to deal with it. And now, how do you deal with the major cause when it's the Americans? And furthermore, the specific American decision maker who's at the heart of all of this has been known to be very difficult in terms of any type of response, criticism, whatever you want to call. So you've got a problem that they're creating much of the economic chaos that we're facing. And you've got a leader that, if he just takes something out of, if he gets personally offended, he will take policy reaction, which just makes it an incredible mess.
Canada as host, I guess by definition has a central role, but it's interesting when you look at Canada's position going in. I think Mark Carney has tried to improve Canada's stature globally, has sought to foster alliances with our European partners. He's extended some significant invitations to this summit. So what do you see as Canada's role going into this?
Well, it's an interesting role because as the host, you always have a certain set of responsibility. You get to decide who comes in outside of the membership of the G7. That the membership comes. But for example, we see Carney inviting the Prime Minister of India, bringing in the President of Mexico. These are at the bequest of the host nation, and so it's Carney. I think the other thing that Carney is dealing with, and then you sort of allude to it within the essence of your question, of course, is Carney, I think, is trying to show that he is not Trudeau. And because we look at so many of the Trudeau policies that I think quite problematically that our G7 partners saw as making Canada irrelevant within the international sphere, particularly when you look at the defense component of Canadian policy, where there was always a lot of talk, but very little action in terms of what we actually were doing from a defensive perspective. where the Americans, of course, started seeing us as a free rider even before Trump gets reelected in the second term. And of course, the Europeans have not quite as vocally as the Americans, but have been very concerned about our inability to get anywhere near the 2%. Now, what Carney has to do is he has to prove to the other members of the G7 that he's not Trudeau. When he says he's going to do something when it comes to defense, it's actually going to happen. Because remember, Trudeau was very good at making all sorts of promises. I mean, the strong, secure, and engaged defense policy was a well thought out document. Just nothing happened. Remember, a lot of important statements were made after the second phase of the Ukrainian war started back in 2022. But as soon as his defense minister, Anita Arendt, started doing something, he fires her from the position and puts her into a position at the Treasury Board that she actually had to reverse some of the stuff that she'd done. So Carney has to show that when he says we are going to meet the 2% in a year, when we're going to get serious about defense, that somehow he's able to convince our friends and allies that, in fact, unlike the last 10 years, when the government says it's going to do it, it actually does do it.
Right. Well, it's interesting because maybe we're finally getting to 2% as it's becoming a bit of an outdated target. So there's an issue. But still, I think that was a pretty significant announcement that we're going to do this and do this year. So I guess, A, how significant is that? But also, B, how doable is that?
Well, I guess I push back about the significance. As I said, I go back to the preceding Liberal statements. They were well thought out. They were significant. They just weren't followed through. And Carney, at least I think for outside observers, has to prove that somehow he's different than simply just promising good ideas. I mean, none of the ideas that the preceding government had come up with were harebrained or problematic. They just didn't follow through. Now, the other problem that we're facing is that there are all sorts of indication that as difficult as politically difficult it has been for Canada to reach 2%, NATO is probably going to up that to 5% at the next NATO summit. And that's coming in about a month's time. And so even to talk about getting us to 2%, all of a sudden is like, we're shutting the door after the cow's gone in this particular issue. It's important that we show that we are moving forward, and it's very important to show that the monies are in fact being spent on these various issues. I mean, we're in a very dangerous geopolitical environment, and when conflict does come to Canada, and it's increasingly looking as if it's not a when, but if, we're going to have to go to war with whatever capabilities we have, be it an expanded war in Europe to go to defend our NATO allies. If something happens and if the Chinese decide to make a move against Taiwan and Canada becomes involved in that conflict, if you don't have you're not going to have the luxury that we had in both World War I and World War II, if you can call it a luxury. I guess, that may be an unfortunate term, but you don't have the ability to build up your military capabilities and come in. The battles are such that, and the technologies are such that if you don't have your destroyers ready, if you don't have your fighters in place, if you don't have your submarines ready, you're not going to be able to sit back and say, okay, we've got the 5 years to build it. And so Carney has to show that, yes, Canada is playing a role, not only just to be a good ally, but because of this increasingly dangerous international security environment, the only way that we're going to deter our adversaries from actually engaging in force is to show that we could seriously meet them back. And so having a complete military capability to fight is increasingly becoming one of the most important deterrent actions that the West can have. And so all of this is crucial. All of this should have been done 10 years ago. We can't go back in time. We can only start now. And hopefully Carney will be different from Trudeau, that this isn't just talk, that we'll actually see follow through.
Well, I guess new fighter jets might fall under that category of things we should have done some years ago. But that's a big and that's an important one. We just had the Auditor General this week raising some more concerns about the cost of all of this, the relationship with the United States, raising some questions, just as we seem to have landed on the F-35s. We are buying some, but is there now an open question as to whether we might source fighter jets elsewhere, and where does that leave us?
Yeah, and that's so problematic because it illustrates the difficulty that has occurred with the election of Trump into his second term. There should be no question of going for the F-35. All of our allies are going for the F-35. The British have gone for it, the Norwegians, Danes, Finnish. All of the countries that operate in northern parts of Europe have gone for the F-35. The F-35, to understand it properly, it's a system of system aircraft. In other words, it's not like in World War II where you'd see a Spitfire by itself and it's firing, and that's really, it's operating as a sort of a unique piece instrument of war. An F-35 ties into your overall system for surveillance. It ties into a whole series of abilities to give you a much better grounding when war comes. So in other words, that's why everybody's going for the F-35. Unfortunately, this technology is always going to be expensive. And so when the Auditor General says the costs are going to be more, of course, everybody has faced that situation. Modern war capability is difficult, and it is never cheap. So it's always going to cost more than what you expect. The problem that has occurred because of Trump's statements, because of what Trump has done in terms of cutting off munitions and other supplies to the Ukrainians, is that everybody's saying, whoa, can he do this to us? Now, part of the problem is, of course, is that unless he mounts a out and out revolution to basically put himself as an authoritative leader of the United States, he will be gone in 3 years. The Chinese and the Russian threat will not. And so, you've got to balance against this very unstable American president who has taken action to hurt friends and allies. There's no question, that's not rhetoric. He has done that to the Ukrainians. And there's a real possibility. But the problem is, do we sort of cut our nose to spite our face? Because the F-35 really, compared to anything else, and looking at what our allies are that we would be fighting alongside with, really is the only aircraft to respond. It's got its issues, no question about it, but it still stands head and shoulders, in my evaluation, over anything that, say, the Swedes or the French might be able to offer us in this context. So do you sort of swallow hard and say, you know what, I resent having to bow or whatever to Trump, but realizing that the threat is much more longer and much more serious from the Russians and the Chinese. So again, this is something that's difficult, but probably something, hopefully, we're going to see Carney somehow trying to political stick handle. Because if we start saying now, we're going to now re-examine another aircraft, that just means what? We get the final aircraft in 2050? That's just going to be too late.
Well, in the meantime, it's interesting as we're potentially going down that path. Maybe we're integrating further with the Americans when it comes to continental defense or missile defense specifically. So, I mean, is that contradictory at any level? And what do you make of what's happening on that side?
Yeah, again, this is indicative of the type of threat that we're facing. We can't work with the Europeans or any of our Asian friends to get proper continental defense. I mean, you can't have a satellite system that is going to give us warning of, say, Russian hypersonics or Chinese hypersonics for that matter, or entry of, say, Russian submarines in or near any of our approaches with European allies. I mean, they can help, but it's with the Americans that the systems are so fast. You don't have the luxury of saying, okay, we're going to sort of have a detection system with the Europeans. They're going to let us know, and then we're going to respond accordingly. It's just at that point, hypersonic missiles, if the Russians attack, are hitting us. I mean, you've only gotten, it's gotten ridiculously short, down to basically almost a 10-minute warning, and even shorter in some instances. We've got no choice. And here's the kicker. We see very clearly with both the Russians and the Chinese are developing both delivery systems, nuclear warheads, and policy that is making the possibility of nuclear war that much more real. We're in Herman Kahn's Thinking the Unthinkable. The only way that you can properly deter that is to let the Russians and the Chinese know, yes, we will detect any effort that you make for an attack on North America. And we can only do that with the Americans. And so we get into this situation. Trump, of course, is very difficult to deal with. He's destabilizing our security elements. But again, we have to stop and say, well, okay, but in the terms of protecting Canada, do we hold our nose and say, yeah, we've got to work with this person who's so destabilizing? Or do we simply say, well, it's just too difficult, but then put Canadians at risk because of the growing threats that are coming from the Russians and the Chinese?
Let me just ask you too. I mean, it's I think helpful that the Ukrainians have taken out some of those Russian bombers, but it does speak to some of the challenges we face in the Arctic, where there is, I think, an element of bilateral cooperation with the Americans. But I think we got to do more. Are you seeing anything in what the Prime Minister has laid out and increased defense spending that's going to mean the Arctic becomes a bigger priority?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the greatest difficulties we always face to trying to talk about Arctic security is that we always confound sovereignty and security together. Sovereignty is just saying we get to do what we want within our boundaries. But the irony is our security since 1956 has basically addressed one of the most critical sovereignty issues, and that is aerospace. We basically worked out through the NORAD agreement with the Americans that has been upheld through that period with both Republican and Democratic presidents with no problem, where we have a shared aerospace. And so we can respond, as we showed when the Chinese sent their balloons through northern North
Right.
America. We can respond seamlessly with the Americans. And again, the Russian and Chinese technology requires that in fact does it. But here's the kicker again. Trump becomes so problematic because as soon as he starts talking about annexing Canada, and I mean, when I see Haregrath announcing that he's got a plan for the invasion of Greenland, and we're
Yeah.
sitting there going, why, on what rational process? Because both of them say they understand, the Americans say they understand the Russian and Chinese threat, though, of course, there are the issues about Trump's relationship with Putin. But why would you be upsetting two of your critical Arctic allies at this point in time? I mean, it's insanity, quite frankly,
Yeah.
and not clear at all what the American administration is trying to do. But again, we get back to this issue. For Canada to actually be a meaningful deterrent to the possibility of either Russia or China thinking that things have changed enough that they could actually take the chance of launching a nuclear strike. It wouldn't be a full out blast. We're not talking about sort of the type of scenarios that we had during the Cold War. We're talking about either taking out the decision making capability of the Americans, i.e., Washington, or taking out their ability to see and react. So you're taking out sort of your warning sights, you're taking
Right.
out the capability. So you're trying to blind and befuddle the Americans for that period in time in which you make your move into Poland, into Baltics, and then you sit back and say, okay, now what are you going to do? The only way that you deter the Russians from doing that is saying, no, you're not going to get a surprise strike on us. You're not going, we're going to detect it and we will have the capability of responding to you. We need to do that again with the Americans. And the Americans are just making it so difficult with the last 100 days of what Trump is doing. I mean, nobody understands why he would be doing that, because that is undermining American security, which he
Yeah.
says is the number one thing that he wants to be doing.
Absolutely. Well, big moments, an important summit. We'll see what comes out of it. Professor Huebert, we'll leave it there. Appreciate your insights on all of this. Thank you so much for joining us here.
My pleasure, Rob.